this capitalist horizon. And then at the bottom, okay, I got it. Is that me? Okay, there. And at the bottom are these bank holdings, right? Frozen assets as well. So it's pretty amazing he was invited to paint these types of critical visions. The one on the left in 2011, in the midst of not the Great Depression, but the Great Recession, became the poster for the 2011 exhibition. So this was a picture taken on the subway of the advertisement, and it was tagged by members of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Okay. And then in the square right by Wall Street, where the movement began, and which was occupied for months on end, the image on the right was used as a protest poster. Okay. Diego Rivera would have been very pleased by this historical coincidence, because he deeply believed that art and politics went together and that art could bring about social transformations. I'm working on the technology here. It's not advanced, no. You don't want to stop sharing. Yeah.
Well, but then it's not on the screen.
It's not.
So if you share.
Now, is this gonna let me? Yeah, okay. Okay. All right, good for now. It was a short presentation, but I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, so my too many things to worry about here. I better let me spit out my gum. So my experience with Diego Rivera and with Mexico began when I was 14 years old, taking Spanish in my small little rural high school, and I still am incredibly impressed that my Spanish teacher took a busload of students down to Mexico City. And I don't remember much. There was a lot of tequila, and but I do remember visiting Diego Rivera's mural in the National Palace. It was an extraordinary vision of another culture, of another history, and I'd like to say it changed my life. It didn't really in the short term. In fact, I had lots of digressions. I didn't think about Mexico or Diego Rivera for another 10 years. I went on to study history and literature, as you know, of the United States when I was at Harvard. But I was also very much came of age under Ronald Reagan's Cold Wars in Central America. And so I was reading Faulkner, and then I was doing political work, and I was protesting, and I got very interested and committed to one, stopping those wars, changing policy, and then in the longer term, I decided that I needed to study Latin American history in order to really understand and make a difference. And somehow I convinced Berkeley to accept me, even though I never had a course in Latin American history. And that brought me back to Latin America, and even more specifically to Mexico, which quickly appealed to me in so many ways as a topic for my dissertation. Still no Diego Rivera. Then I got the job at the University of Puget Sound and teaching Latin American history, and particularly Mexican history. It was very easy to resort to Diego Rivera's vision of history, of Mexican history. In fact, many of us have a vision of Mexico that comes from Diego Rivera, right? And so I began incorporating it mostly as illustration, without ever really sort of problematizing what those images might mean. The first book project that I did, my dissertation, was on the way that working people in Mexico City experienced the rural upheaval of the Mexican Revolution, right? A peasant revolution. I was interested for a variety of reasons in the role of urban workers in experiencing that revolution and how it transformed them and how they projected themselves in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. And this print here by this self-taught printer, Jose Guadalupe Posada, really, he lived mostly in the 19th century. He died just at the beginning of the revolution. And this is a print of people protesting against the re-election of Porfirio Diaz, the dictator of Mexico for the last 30 years of the 19th century, right up until 1910. And I thought this image really captures what I'm trying to show. And it was the perfect cover. I still love it to this day. It was only after I finished that book and it came out, and I was beginning to think about my next project, which I really wanted to start tackling art, did I actually look at the original source of that image, right? And this is it right here. And I read the text, and of course Posada didn't write the text, he did the image. But the text and the image are completely at odds with each other. And they talk about these sort of rabble in the streets and how they're threatening stability and they're threatening peace and the wonderful prosperity that the dictator has brought us. And so this is when I began to problematize my use of images as simply illustrations. And I began to think about them as, in fact, artifacts of a particular moment in which the context, it could tell us much about the context, and also ultimately about arguments about the past. This is, I wasn't the only one to make this mistake, because Posada was rediscovered after the revolution, and he was celebrated by a group of Marxist-inspired, Communist Party affiliated artists, painters like Rivera, and the most famous printmaker was Leopoldo Mendez. And here he shows part of the argument that I assume in connecting them. And here is Posada, and he's looking out on the streets and seeing the police officers beating up the protesters, and he's indignant, right? Even though, in fact, when the revolution occurred, he was quite, even though he had denounced the abuses of the dictatorship, he in fact did not support the armed action against the dictators, or even strikes for that matter. My next book project sort of helped me develop this methodology more, and it's essentially about the relationship between post-revolutionary artists on the left and organized labor, and the way that together they created an image of the working class as central actors in Mexican history, and central actors in the possible future transformation of Mexico. This time, when I chose my cover image, I was a little more careful, and I talk about this image quite a bit. In some ways, it's sort of the climax of this process of social transformation that happens after the Mexican Revolution in the 20s and the 30s. And in 1935, it's kind of a high point where the working class through unions under Mexico's greatest post-revolutionary president, Lázaro Cárdenas, they form major unions, National Confederation. They come into an alliance with the Communist Party, you know, the way sort of FDR's New Deal on steroids. They bring about many of the changes that the revolution finally promised. And this is in many ways emblematic of that moment in 1935. It was an image in the Machete, the Communist Party newspaper. It shows United Workers and their the acronyms of their organizations are also here. It suggests the alliance with the government because some of them are bureaucrats working for the government. It puts peasants and farmer and workers together. And it puts a woman at the very center. Right at a moment when women became organized as well in a broad confederation, and this was very unusual because women were not workers in the vision of these artists. Right, women were portrayed in supportive roles, and here. In this particular image, a woman is put at the center of this broader coalition. And then best of all is this was produced by a collective of artists, the League of Revolutionary Writers and Artists, the LEAR. So it's very interesting in itself that it was a collectively signed. I didn't have to get copyright permission because it's collective, right? And that organization no longer exists. And of course, it's kind of a free plug and a joke for the book itself. My name appears twice. So I started thinking about Diego Rivera. I thought about him, quite a bit in the earlier projects and experiences as well, but I wasn't quite ready to take him on. But what really convinced me to begin this project were these two biographies that had very different visions and arguments about Diego Rivera. In the first one, this is a quote from the first one done in 1939, and it says, as you can see, Diego Rivera is the world's most significant revolutionary artist. The second one, Diego was a professional only in painting. In politics, he was an amateur and a passionate dilettante. Okay, so very different visions written by the same person. Bertram Wolfe, who was a founder of the US Communist Party. He was exiled in Mexico during the sort of anti-red raids he did in Mexico. He became close and a member of the Mexican Communist Party. That's where he met Diego Rivera. He got kicked out of the Communist Party, just like Diego Rivera did a couple years later, 28 and 29. They both got expelled. And then they became very close again in the 1930s when Bertram Wolfe was back in Mexico. They had a variety of projects, some of which I'll talk about here together. And one of them was that first biography. Okay? During the Cold War, Diego Rivera reconciled with the Communist Party. Bertram Wolfe became a Cold Warrior, worked for the State Department, ended up at the Hoover Institute. And after Rivera died, he sort of rewrote his own past vis-a-vis his interpretation of Diego Rivera, in which the nationalist Diego Rivera, the folkloric Diego Rivera was the real great painter, and everything else was just sort of naive or opportunistic politics. So this really intrigued me, and of course he also conveniently bought up all the old copies of this, refused to allow it to be reprinted, and this has become the definitive biography of Diego Rivera. There's a huge literature on Diego Rivera. There haven't been many biographies. So in many ways, this second Diego Rivera is the one that has become a fairly standard interpretation, not the only one. There is one other biography I should mention, more recent, widely read, very readable, by Patrick Marnham, Dreaming with His Eyes Open. And Marnham knew nothing about Mexico, knows nothing, he's still alive. He did no original research. He did not take the Mexican Revolution seriously. And this is a sort of a typical comment. This is one of Diego Rivera's extraordinary murals. It's in an old church on an hacienda that's been occupied by the Mexican government and turned into an agricultural school to school the peasants who've been given land. Right? And it's really kind of a Sistine Chapel-like ode to agrarian reform and agriculture. But looking at these naked women, this is Diego Rivera's pregnant wife at the time. And this is his lover, Tina Madotti, Italian photographer, his lover at the time. So they're both in there, right? You can imagine the problems he had at home with this mural. So Marnham says the deeper message of Chupingo is not about politics, it's about sex. So this is kind of gives you a flavor of that ignoring such an essential aspect of Diego Rivera's painting and being. So maybe it is about sex. We can talk about it if you want, but it's not just about sex, and it's not the most important part of that. Certainly not to an audience who looks at it today, or even to most of the people who looked at it at the time that it was written, the time that it was painted. Let me catch up here. Not that I so that I'm. Okay, so so what does Diego's life and art look like through this political lens that I'm trying to recuperate in this study? And I'd like you to think about and look at these two self-portraits of Diego Rivera. He didn't do a lot of self-portraits, certainly not like his wife Frida Kahlo, but these two I think are particularly suggestive and significant. In this one, in the making of a fresco, Rivera portrays himself sitting. No. In this, the making of a fresco, the making of a city, Diego Rivera portrays himself on the scaffolding, painting a fresco about the making of San Francisco. And at the center of it, he puts, you can barely see it, I'm sorry about the quality of this projection. At the center of it, you can see he puts a working man at the center. So it's about the combination of labor that creates everything, certainly the cities we live in, as well as the process of creating art. This is so it's part of Diego Rivera that centers on labor and the proletariat and the ways that labor transforms the world around us as well as humankind. So this is one thread that I'm going to talk about quite a bit today. This one is a later mural. It's a Cold War mural, and it's boy, this we're missing something quite a bit here. It's why am I this? I know this. It's a portion of Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in the Alameda, which is like the central park of Mexico City, right? And you see the adolescent Rivera right here as a child. This is he's sort of remembering his childhood. This is kind of a late in life reflection, and on this side is the engraver Jose Guadalupe Posada. In the center is one of his famous creations, these calaveras, these skeletons that sort of reflect on the brevity of life and the vanity of wealth. And then right behind him is his latest and greatest of his three wives, Frida Kahlo, who has an arm around him, right? And then there's more going on. There are elements of Mexican history. There are class differences. The revolution is, the dictator's on one side, the revolution's about to enter there on the other side. This I see as really a sort of form of nationalism. It's partly about folklore, it's partly about culture, right? I think Diego would like to have thought of these three people as the big three cultural figures of Mexico, his wife and his supposed mentor, Jose Guadalupe Posada. So I think in many ways we can argue that there are two Diegos, right? And there's this nationalist folkloric element, and there's this Marxist-inspired appreciation of the centrality of workers and the possibility of a socialist transformation. Okay? And you see them in different moments. You see them sometimes in the same mural. Sometimes they're in tension, and I'd say most of all, they are featured in different moments of his life. Right. So I see the what I'm going to focus on today is that first story, what I call a proletarian cycle, that is characterized by that takes place in that first post-revolutionary moment of the 1920s and the 1930s, in the midst of the great transformations of the Mexican Revolution, and very much with the Bolshevik Soviet Revolution in mind. Okay. By 1940, World War II, the Cold War, it's a very different scenario. Certainly in Mexico, in much of the world, certainly for well until at least until the 60s, where we have a sort of a new revolutionary moment. And in that phase, which I think in general Rivera was much less creative for Diego Rivera, with the exception of Dream of a Sunday Afternoon, which I think is just beautiful and lyrical. But in that period, his political work is much less interesting, much less creative, but so were the politics of the period. Well, that was a long introduction. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I want to, before I jump into that sort of sequencing of his art, I want to briefly touch on some aspects of his early life and his early self-mythologizing, right? This is very much, Rivera is a tremendous storyteller, and on these painted walls, it works in amazing ways, both as real reflection on the past and the moment, and also in terms of the myths that he's dealing with. But it's also a part of his testimony and recounting of his own life, which he does a lot in his later years, various forms of testimony. So I just have a few quotes up here, all from this short autobiography. So it's basically an oral testimony that he gives. And these are sort of excerpts. Though I was only 9, with her I came to manhood. You don't want to hear the rest, or if you do, you'll know where to find him, right? But this is one of his myths about his self-created myths, his virility. Another is that he was born a radical. So he writes, through our plot against the dictator Diaz, though our plot fizzled, I went to the south where I joined Zapata's peasant partisans. Okay. He did come back to Mexico in 1910 when the revolution broke out. He had a fellowship from the Porfirio Diaz, the dictator, to study in Paris. He came back for the celebration of Mexican independence and he sold a lot of paintings. And then he got out of there very fast and spent the revolution in Paris, right? About that time, I met and came under the influence of the great folk artist, Jose Guadalupe Posada, the most important of my teachers, right? That's the man he paints himself next to. That's the man who, gave me a cover for my dissertation book. Posada was, or rather, Diego Rivera got a fairly conventional, traditional education at the art school of the old Academy of Arts under the dictatorship. And he got a fellowship there. He really did not break many rules. This is the kind of thing he was painting, right? Which is really extraordinary, but it very much reflected the traditional landscape modes of his mentor, the great Mexican painter, Velasco. Here it is, as he wrote his testimonies, he would do these little drawings. So here he shows himself sneaking into the studio of his unofficial invented mentor, Jose Guadalupe Posada, who had this very primitive style that spoke a lot to post-revolutionary painters, but was not taken seriously by anyone in the art school, right? So it's an interesting invention, not that surprising among famous people and artists in particular inventing their lives. The real aesthetic revolution of Rivera happens in Paris. Right? He spends a couple years in Spain and doesn't really sort of do any dramatic rethinking because Spain is almost as far behind in the avant-garde transformations that are happening in Paris. Then he moves to Paris and he gets very much involved. He tries on all these different hats. He describes spending his days with later, he describes spending his evenings with Lenin and revolutionaries in the cafes, but in fact, he spent that 10 years very intensely painting all the time, trying on one style or another. This is the only painting that makes any reference to labor. He became a sort of fairly well-known cubist and a colleague, friend, and rival of Pablo Picasso. This is really about the only artistic image that refers directly to Mexico, while he's in Mexico. Okay? Nonetheless, it was an extraordinary preparation for the artist he became. And it's a certain irony that the most important event in Mexican history he spent in Paris, and it helps us to understand in some ways why he invents this radical past. But he certainly had a radical future. He describes returning to Mexico in 1921, and he says that I am reborn. He returned in 1921 at 34 years old, and he's speaking mostly in aesthetic terms about rediscovering the purity of Mexican colors and forms. He quickly recentered his artistic style and subject around Mexico with Posada and elements of indigenous and popular culture as important references. His rebirth was also a response to a society transformed by a decade of social revolution and the process of its own reinvention. The revolution pitted largely peasant armies against the old elitist and unequal order. In a second phase, led by peasant leaders like Zapata and Pancho Villa, that movement was defeated by a coalition led by reformist middle-class leaders. But this new middle class is obliged to address and control social demands through real reforms supplemented by nationalist education and cultural policies. Most prominent and relevant today were government commissions for a series of murals in public buildings, of which Rivera received the lion's share. But he quickly sought to radicalize the government's mildly nationalist muralist project. For example, the new government broke with pre-revolutionary Eurocentrism by celebrating the mestizo. people of mixed race and mixed cultures. But many of Rivera's paintings instead put indigenous people and cultures at the center of the nation, both past and present. Even more important were Rivera's invocations of peasant struggles, often around the figure of martyred agrarian leader Zapata in ways that reinforced the ongoing demands of peasants for land. Rivera saw muralism as a rejection of bourgeois models of art. Instead of workers working in studios and marketing their art to the wealthy or museums, muralists emphasized their artisanal labor. He repeatedly identified himself as an intellectual worker, and he celebrated the collective nature of mural production, with its plasters, with its multiple assistants, its collective viewing by the public in public places. He and other artists also formed artist collectives that call themselves unions. Of course, there were limits to this vision. Rivera was always in charge. He had a big team, but he's the one who gave the orders and did all of the painting himself. He was also very quick to distance himself from from the artists' unions when solidarity with them compromised his own increasing number of commissions with the government. And of course, the assumed lower class public for these murals was not always obvious. For the most part, new art forms and new subjects went hand in hand with political mobilizations. Rivera, for example, very quickly joined the Communist Party in 1922. And for most of the rest of his life, he would identify with the dominant or with dissident communisms. In the 20s and 30s, he formed close ties to Mexico's small but newly organized working class, labor unions, and peasant leagues. And he established similar ties when he was painting his famous mural in Detroit and in New York City. But most importantly, he projected the struggles and organization of working people in his murals. This created some tensions with the government. For example, in this mural, in the Secretary of Education, he was forced to remove this incendiary poem, right? So you have these workers entering the foreign-owned mine, carrying their crosses and then being searched for stolen nuggets of silver or gold as they came out. So he painted this poem on it. Comrade Miner, make daggers of these metals and you will see that the metals will then belong to you. And the Minister of Education said, no, you can't do this, and forced him to paint it over. He wrote it down on a piece of paper, he dug a hole into the mural, and he put it in there. So it was sort of a symbolic gesture. It's still there today, presumably. After a trip to the Soviet Union in 1927, Rivera further radicalized his murals. In this panel, known as the Arsenal, he incorporates the symbols of Soviet communism and proposes a proletarian-led extension of the Mexican Revolution to finish off the current bourgeois capitalist order. Note here that he includes his new girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, Frida Kahlo, and also his former lover, the photographer Tina Amadotti, both of them in red blouses. Tina Amadotti is looking into the eyes of her new lover, the Cuban founder of the Communist Party, Mayo. The tensions between nationalism and radicalism and the calibration of what was acceptable to his government patrons are evident in Rivera's National Palace mural, right? It was commissioned at a time when an increasingly conservative Mexican government clashed with a hyper-radicalized Communist Party, one that, following the Communist international policy, broke all its previous alliances with progressive forces to push for radical revolution. The Mexican Communist Party, which had previously celebrated its most important member, Diego Rivera, in 1929 declared him the government's house painter and expelled him for refusing to give up his government commissions. Their claim was not without some substance. this epic mural of Mexican history that thrilled me when I was 14 portrays 400 plus years of colonial and national history with too great a density to really get into much detail in this slide. It features political elites at the top and anonymous indigenous, peasant, and urban workers in the middle, witnessing and participating in key moments of Mexican history, including the conquest, the struggle for independence, the 1910 revolution, and struggles against 19th century foreign interventions, including that of the United States and the French.
Question?
Yeah.
To what extent was Diego a propagandist? In other words, a lot of the concepts around class that were coming up at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, were intellectuals who were beginning to analyze class struggles, capital, role, and so forth. But they're speaking in text, which is not really available to working class. It's not a mode of communication, but at the same time, you have films just beginning, these new technologies, eventually radio. So is he understanding that he's trying to communicate concepts that are coming out of this analysis to a general public through imagery? Does he see that? Does he go?
Well, he's
John, could you repeat the question for the microphone so people can hear? I'm sorry, just really, it's short, like.
Yeah, so this is question in short, is this propaganda? Is he aware of the messages he's trying to send? Are they deliberate?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a really, the whole mural project, it drew upon the Italian Renaissance, right? The project of the church to convey religious beliefs to people who were not particularly literate. And that was certainly the case of the majority of Mexicans, about 90% in 1920 could not read. I think it was a bit higher in the city. So that was part of the project. And of course, the propaganda that was originally intended was about nationalism, right? It was about imagining the nation in a new way that was more inclusive than that of previous governments, such as that of the dictatorship, right? So this was a project that the government had in mind, right? So that's one kind of propaganda, and we see it in our own school textbooks and our own monuments, and that was. But I guess there's more to it than that, because
I don't think the word propaganda is negative.
no, in fact, Rivera was accused of propaganda. He said, "Damn right." He said, if it's not trying to make a difference and convey a message, then there's no point in it. It's like pure art, right? Which that was a dirty word for him, right? Art for art's sake. This is, and remember, he joins the Communist Party, right? So what we see here, and this is true of a lot of non-Soviet, non-Russian communists, is that it's partly this international religion, and it's partly a way of revisioning their own nation in a different way. Right? And it sort of moves back and forth. This mural is in the National Palace. It was the Colonial Palace. Before that, it was Montezuma's palace. It's a central place in the nation. It's where the Aztecs originally were told that they should build their city because of if they saw an eagle on a cactus with a serpent in its mouth, right, which is on the Mexican flag. And so it's a very loaded place, right? And this is one historian, Fulgaray, talks about this mural as really about patriotism and accepting the authority of the national elite. So for him, patriotism is a dirty word, right? It's kind of a Marxist perspective. He says this revolutionary artist is not conveying revolution. He's basically painting for his patrons, and he reads this in terms of this sort of central figure of the eagle on the founding cactus, right, which is also on the flag. He makes this argument in terms of this sort of clustering. These are the international interventions here, right? So, and then the conquest at the bottom, the invasion of the Spaniards, right, and the indigenous culture. So it's kind of about the creation of Mexico, but he's also, like here, his vision of the revolution. People who there's very little difference. This is the old dictatorship. These are the revolutionaries. These are revolutionaries who fought with each other and killed each other. But here they're all sort of bunched together. And the masses here that Rivera inserts into this story we see just their backs. They're sort of watching, they're passive. So this is the interpretation of this historian. He even says, these three walls coincide with the three colors of the flag. So that basically this is a big flag, the details don't matter. So this is propaganda, but it's propaganda for the government, which was at its most conservative moment after the revolution in this period, right? And I think it's a brilliant argument, but and it's perhaps a valid one, but it's contested in part by what Rivera painted when he came back from his 5 years in the United States, when he joined the Trotskyist party in Mexico, and he painted this vision of the exploitation of masses, of corrupt business and political leaders in Mexico. This was his patron for the major wall, no longer president, but he's painted here with sort of enemies of the people, the military, and the church. And then he envisions here Marx sort of directing a future transformation based on revolution and not reform. That's a text from Marx himself. He's pointing to this socialist future. So it's another kind of propaganda. It's one that the government of Mexico in the 1930s, Lázaro Cárdenas, the most progressive president of the post-revolutionary period, probably wasn't happy with, right? Because his policies were much more about collaboration and reform. And here, there's the central part of Mexico City is up in flames. So I really see this as kind of a Trotskyist interpretation of that moment, right? So these different forms of propaganda are competing with each other if we grant that interpretation of the art historian who calls the main wall propaganda that supports the status quo. And so Rivera was always sort of attuned to his patrons, and often provoking in small ways and sometimes provoking in really, really big ones. Right? So he was expelled from the Communist Party, and he, in some ways that was a blessing, because he became much more acceptable to business patrons in the United States. So he spent much of the next 5 years in the United States, starting with painting murals in San Francisco. This one is called The Allegory of California. It was in the San Francisco Stock Investors Club. And it's fairly staid, but it's basically about the creation of enormous wealth in California. But it's also features labor in a way that was very unusual at the time for any kind of art outside of the new masses and leftist magazines, much less on public murals, much less in the stock exchange. And this is Helen Wills, the great tennis star, and his girlfriend at the time. Frida, his new wife, was painting at home. And then he painted again this other vision, which in the same period, the making of a fresco showing the building. And again, labor is central. At the same time, this wasn't particularly controversial. Right? The controversy was, why is a Mexican painter doing this instead of a local painter? No local painter could have done that at this point, though. There would be many little Diegos painting murals in the aftermath of this. The other controversy was, why is he insulting us by showing us his butt? But that was the extent of it. In some ways, this is kind of a practice as he's kind of calibrating his understanding of his patrons and how much of his message, be it propaganda, he's willing to roll out at a particular time. He was fascinated by the United States. He was partly because he was always fascinated by machines. Add to that a layer of reading of Marx, visit to the Soviet Union in the middle of their industrialization project, and he was just thrilled to be in the United States in a real industrializing country. Probably his greatest mural, in my opinion, is the making of Detroit industry. He was invited by the Detroit Museum of Art, which was essentially funded by Henry Ford and his son, and he basically filled up the courtyard of this neo-Italianate museum, and you know, one side shows this sort of dance between machinery and workers, and they're making the engines here, and on the other side they're making the chassis, and he went to the River Rouge and spent a long time just making drawings, and he tried to squeeze it all in, as well as some of the other industries in Detroit, like pharmaceuticals. He does some interesting things. This is just one of them connecting the United States and Mexico. He chose an older stamping machine rather than the newest one, because it reminded him of one of the Aztec earth mother goddesses, right? So you can see some of the similarities here. He painted industrial women workers for the very first time to convey the pharmaceutical industry. What he didn't do, you know, there are hints here of labor resistance, you know, people watching over each other. You get a sense of a really fast-paced, tailorized process of speeding up work. This happened in the midst of the Depression when lots of workers had been laid off. Black and Mexican workers were the first ones to get laid off. A month before he arrived, there was a major protest in front of the River Rouge factory, and Henry Ford sort of brought out the police that he owned, and about 30 people were killed. So in some ways, he ignores some of these big issues, and the Communist Party was his greatest critique. Remember, he was out of the Communist Party. The US Communist Party really celebrated his work until he was expelled, and then suddenly, without the guidance of the Communist Party, his work became problematic. But it's an interesting question that, in this sense, that sort of anti-capitalist message, or even the exploitation of workers that you see in the protests, that the uprising that he painted for the earlier museum, it's really not obvious. The major controversy was around this image of a child being vaccinated, right, which the church took to be a parody of the baby Jesus and the Virgin. Yes.
Well, Detroit, I'm very familiar with that one painting. And I built those machines for the million people, but you didn't have anything up by first place, you weren't there. You were back on the street. If you didn't have work done by first place, you weren't there.
Exactly. Yeah.
They watched you.
Yeah. Yeah. Particularly, I went there last.
So you could paint that guy.
Yeah, and I think this was really his baby, and it's still kind of a mystery to me why he doesn't portray that.
You don't wanna get fired.
He didn't want to get fired, right? He wanted to finish his painting, and, you know, and Henry Ford was, you know, anti-Semite and publishing, you know, some terrible stuff about Jews and bankers. And I think also he was just incredibly fascinated by this mechanic who had become, built this incredible industry. I think he gave him, in terms of both self preservation, in terms of this finishing this painting, and in terms of the possibility of trying to capture that in a mural on a wall. And you know, it's a good question, and whether it would have been as extraordinary if he had more directly inserted that propaganda into it.
One thing, all those machines are in Mexico.
Exactly, yes. Yes, this was part of the Mexican industrialization. I found some letters in the Henry Ford archive of Frida Kahlo writing Henry Ford saying, "Could you please give my boyfriend a job?" And I'm glad I got to mention that Frida had boyfriends too, and girlfriends.
We're gonna hold questions until he's done, and then I'll get a mic out to people, because the others can't hear it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, yeah, that's probably a good idea, or I'll have you here all night, or I'll be talking to one or two empty seats, one of which is my wife's. Okay, so he finished this mural and he got on a train and he went to his next commission. He was getting one commission after another. And the next one was at the new Rockefeller Center, which was about to be inaugurated, right? And Rockefeller hired or his builder hired a variety of artists to do these different walls. And Rivera, I think he saw this as his moment, right? Rockefeller was not Henry Ford. He was not the great inventor of things and transforming society through machines. You know, if you ask Rivera, he would say, this is a necessary step to the revolution. Rockefeller was extracting oil and extracting money. And, he held him in much, he saw him in a different way. And Rockefeller said, they gave him a title, Man at the Crossroads. And so Rivera starts painting this vision of man. This is a terrible image, and it was unfinished, which makes it even worse, right? Because it's black and white. Because this is, yeah, and I'm not surprising anyone. I think here you all know that this there was tension between them. Rivera put Lenin in the painting, and Rockefeller said that's enough. But there was much more going on than this, because Rivera has this vision of man at the center of the universe, facing the future, surrounded by technology that could be used either to continue decadent capitalism. Right? It sounds like propaganda. This is the middle of the Depression. There were real doubts about the vitality of capitalism, and on the other side, he puts a vision of the Soviet Union, right? The same Soviet Union that he had broken with on political terms with Stalin, but that he still saw as a salvageable model for a different future. So this man at the center of the crossroads has a decision to make, which direction to go. And the answer for Rivera is obvious in this direction towards socialism. I want to just point out a couple of things here. Rivera was paid and he was shut down and he was let out. There were protests. I want to point out here Lenin is holding, bringing together the hands of a white industrial worker and a black farmer, right? So his attention to race is interesting, and I'll expand a bit more on that. And this is Bertram Wolfe. This is Bertram Wolfe, who was there for him in New York, was also a dissident communist that we formed an opposition communist party. And this is where Rivera got most of his support. You notice that it puts Lenin in here, not Stalin. right? So he paints his friend Bertram Wolfe here. That opposition Communist Party leads the protests. I think you've seen Rock the Cradle and sort of this, there are a couple scenes in it in which these protests around the censorship and the ultimate destruction of that mural occurred. Rivera would eventually, well, within a year, he would go back to Mexico, and the Mexican government gave him a commission to repaint it in the Fine Arts Palace. It's really sort of out of place there. It's not the same as sticking your nose up in the heart of New York capitalism. But it's still, it was very important to him to have a chance to repaint it. And he, by this time, he was affiliated with the Trotskyists in Mexico. And of course, very soon he would invite Trotsky to seek exile and refuge in Mexico. But he wasn't going to leave town immediately. In fact, the first thing he did is he said, I will repaint my mural with Rockefeller's money, anyone who wants to offer me a wall. But none of the big walls were available, or none of them were willing to deal with this now problematic person. All of his lineup of commissions for like Chrysler were canceled. So what he did is he decided to paint for Bertram Wolfe's opposition Communist Party in their rented tiny headquarters. He did it using these same portable mural methods that he had organized, because he knew that the lease ended on that Communist Party, opposition Communist Party headquarters in a few months or within a year, right? And so he also decided that he couldn't necessarily recreate the Rockefeller mural. So Bertram Wolfe convinced him to do a portrait of America. In some ways, it's a counterpart to his history of Mexico, but it's kind of an unprecedented situation because he's not painting for a government. He's not painting for a rich capitalist. He's painting for a party that was also a set of unions, most of them in the New York City area. Nobody was paying him, he was paying for it. So it's fascinating. Bertram Wolfe wrote a book about it that included the paintings. Not surprisingly, Marx is featured. Not surprisingly, it's a Marxist history. In the book, Wolfe describes, these two tendencies in US history about the Declaration of Independence and its right of revolution and its promises of equality and liberation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the conservative constitution, right? So these are sort of two sort of goalposts that he sets out, and then he tells sort of, not surprisingly, class-based history of the United States in 21 panels. I'm just going to show you a few of those panels. Most of these are in black and white because this portable mural moved several times and it eventually was burned up in fire. So only 5 of them survived. What I really want to point, I don't want to sort of bore you with Marxist history, right? Except to point out that, this is the first Marxist graphic history of the United States that was ever painted. But what I find really astounding is the attention that he pays to the lives, to Black lives in US history. And this was partly because he had a deep sense of racial differences from his experience, from the experience of Mexico. And it was something he was aware of during much of his time in the United States. In the Detroit mural, all those fired Black workers are up there working, right? So he presents this almost utopian vision of racial mixture. And then the other thing is that the Communist Party of the United States was outside of the organizations of Black people themselves, was the most advanced political position about the rights of Black people. It was on their agenda. They saw them first as workers, but they were attentive to race and the situation of Black people. The rampant lynching that characterized the first 30 years and beyond of US history. The opposition Communist Party, for whom he painted this, were even more aware of it because they were in Mexico City. They were in New York City, wishful thinking. They were and they were organizing Harlem. They were organizing tenants. They were organizing Black workers in a variety of ways with a fair amount of success and a very interesting discourse about equality for Black people. So these things came together and helped explain some of these stories that I'm going to show you here. So this is panel 1, Colonial America. It's about the dispossession of indigenous peoples as well as the importation of slaves, slaves as labor, slaves as merchandise, slaves who were enslaved people who were punished for resisting. So there are sort of central figures here. This structure occurring. It's not an image of the Mayflower, like the Pilgrims arriving in Plymouth. This is panel 2, the American Revolution, and at the top you really can't see it here, but George Washington is the figure you'd expect to see is leading the imperial war between the British and the French against the Indians in North America in one scene, and in another scene he is pushing his slaves on his plantation, right? Instead, Ben Franklin and Thomas Paine, who represent this libertarian alternative rooted in the Declaration of Independence, and here they're describing that to a mixture of Black, indigenous, and white people. But what I find particularly interesting is his portrayal here. There's a lot going on there, but in the center is the Boston Massacre. And at the center, he puts, I'm forgetting his first name, Attucks, a Black person, probably a mixed indigenous Black race, a former slave, who was killed as part of the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks is his first name, right? The source of this, Bertram Wolfe tells us, was an engraving by Paul Revere done a couple weeks after the event itself, right? This is sort of how the news got out. And this is, so I looked it up and I found it here. And you can see how many elements were taken directly from, and this also gives you a sense of the process, the collaborative process of creating this mural. Rivera didn't know much history. He depended on Wolfe. He depended on his students. He depended on the research of his assistants. And so you can see the architecture. You can see the soldiers. This is Crispus Attucks here, right? He takes him and he puts, instead of being on the margin, but still present, he puts him in the very center. But I found a lot of versions of this, and after the original in the 19th century, this was recreated a lot, and Attucks was whitened, right? So it's really interesting how the centrality of Blacks in these events was erased in a variety of ways, and it's really interesting how Rivera and his collective put him back at the center. In fact, in many ways, when I first started looking closely at this mural, it was the same time that the 1619 project was asking us to rethink US history around the year in which the first slave was brought from Africa. Right? So this, I think, is a really radical revision of US history that is, I think, extraordinary and speaks to our own times. Just a couple more, the history of the period, even the progressive history, the economic history that paid attention to class was, did not take the, sort of swallowed whole the idea of the Southern historians after the Civil War, that the Civil War was not about slavery. For this vision, the institution of slavery and the agency of Black people is central. So in this one, conflict over slavery, here's Thoreau in writing his essay on civil disobedience against the Mexican War. The blood of President Polk is on this map of Mexico. The acquisition of course, Mexican territory sort of broke open the question of the future of slavery in the United States and the tensions that led to the Civil War. He also puts Frederick Douglass and Nate Turner, Sojourner Weaver, yes. Sojourner Truth, exactly. Thank you. Okay. Once again, the centrality of slavery over in terms of the Civil War, but of course the main figure is John Brown and his armed resistance against slavery, first in bloody Kansas, and of course Harper's Ferry. So he's the real figure, martyred. By contrast, Lincoln is seen as somewhat problematic compared to comparable to the vision of Washington, and some of his more lukewarm statements on the coexistence of Black and white people are included in the text there. Getting close here, and then I'm sure open up for questions. The second half, after Marx, the second half focuses on contemporary industrial America, and this is called the New Freedom, reference to the progressive, supposedly progressive policies of Woodrow Wilson. And unlike Detroit, where workers are sort of dancing out of breath, harassed with the machines, here the machines have sort of taken control of the workers. These are stamping machines, and the women's arms are attached to these machines and pulled out of the way. Again, it sort of paces them. You have this juxtaposition of the Statue of Liberty and prisoner being tortured by a police officer. You have the Scottsboro Nine, these young men who were accused of falsely of raping a white woman and condemned to death. It became a huge cause internationally of the left and of the Communist Party of the United States. Here's Thomas Mooney, socialist leader who was also jailed. And of course, here you have Sacco and Vanzetti, the anarchists who were executed as well. It culminates in this vision of unity among the working class and the sectarian left, right? So here is Lenin again. He's joining white and Black workers. He's also up here with his allies. Here's a not particularly happy Stalin, but the idea is that this was the position of the opposition Communist Party, is they wanted the communist parties to reunite and for the Communist Party to basically democratize itself, right? And yes, that is Einstein there. And then at the bottom are the counterparts, the leaders of the three US Communist parties. And here, of course, is Bertram Wolfe pointing to this symbol of unity. And then this in itself is part of the reason for the unity is the upcoming threat of fascism. Mussolini over here and Hitler here. So this next section, I'm just gonna skip over it, I just wanna convey how much these 4 years that Rivera spent in the United States during the 1930s helped to transform the way art was done and who it was done by. Right? He was very generous, had lots of assistants, even though he did almost all the paintings themselves, but it was a kind of apprenticeship. The whole idea of the works public administration, part of the New Deal, was based on a proposal that referenced Diego Rivera's murals in Mexico and the United States. And so a lot of his assistants went on to become muralists or painters in their own right. Probably the most famous was Ben Shahn, who was his assistant at Rockefeller Center and then at the Portrait of America murals as well. I think some of these references were based on his own previous work, but Rivera thought very highly of him. I tried to find some suggestion that he was actually allowed to paint some of these faces, but I'm not sure. And then he went on under the Works Project Administration to do this beautiful mural of Einstein called Einstein on the Bridge. It's much larger than this, but it's basically about the Jewish migration to the United States, right? So here's Einstein walking with his mother, with Ben Shahn's mother, not Einstein's mother. And then he also worked with several young African-American painters, right? And they borrowed from him in a variety of ways. This is Hal Woodruff, and this is a print of a lynching in 1935. I think this is the first portrait of a lynching by a Black artist, and this is his mutiny on the Amistad, which was a slaving ship that was illegally bringing slaves into the United States, and there was a revolt on the ship that where the Africans took over. This is Charles White with a portrait he did of Rivera. His mural Progress of the American Negro, 5 great American Negroes, and in some ways I think it draws on some of the same characters. Frederick Douglass. Sometimes he directly cites pieces of Rivera's mural. This is the stamping machine in the Detroit mural. This is Thelma Johnson Street, who worked with him in his 1940 San Francisco mural. We haven't talked about it, Pan American Unity. We can, and she also sort of cites him in terms of this is kind of a Black vaccination shot, right? And then it's a sort of similar combination of industry and work. This is pretty much the end. The next part of my project is really kind of about the shift that occurs after 1940 in the world, in Mexico, with World War II, with the Cold War. There are a variety of erasures, starting with the Portrait of America, right? The dissident Communist Party of Bertram Wolfe disappears. They turn in 1941 as part of this process of joining the World War II, and it falls and divides up. They give the murals to the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, which was the largest union for which they had members, right? And after the war, they took those murals and they put them in their summer home in the Poconos, but they put 8 of them in storage because they just seemed a bit too radical. And then in the 60s, that summer resort burned down, and it's the radical ones that survived. The rest were destroyed. Rivera, after the war, decided that he needed to rejoin the Communist Party after a short time, after 3 years as a Trotskyist. During the war, he sort of comes around and he begins a very slow and painful process of rejoining the Communist Party, right? And they extract a lot of blood and penance from him, and it ultimately, it takes over a decade for him to be accepted back, but he's a fellow traveler and a prime funder of the Mexican Communist Party, starting in 1942. And what he called his best murals, I'm not so sure about that, suddenly become his worst murals because he hadn't been in the Communist Party. Bertram Wolfe joins the war effort, becomes a cold warrior. He hates these things that he had written. He tries to disown them. He buys, after Rivera dies, he buys up the rights to this book so that it can't be reprinted. So that mural is still largely unknown, destroyed, and largely unknown. I'm just going to show you a couple more images here of Rivera. This is a full biography, and I still have a lot of work to do on the post 1940 period. It's much less interesting to me. He's less creative. It's a less interesting political period. But these are a couple of his more political murals. One is Nightmare of War, Dream of Peace, done in 1952. It's very much part of the communist international discourse of Stalin as a leader for peace. Stalin is offering the abolition of all nuclear weapons and pushing the Western powers to sign this treaty. So you can see these are the Western powers here. Here is Mao as well. So the leaders of world peace are offering that. It's essentially that with this petition. And this is the Korean War is going on in the background here, and this sort of mural within a mural. So there's another sort of attack on the West. There's an atomic explosion here, and we know who dropped that bomb. Frida Kahlo is in a wheelchair, but she's collecting petitions in Mexico City. Diego Rivera is currying favor with Stalin because he wants to get back in the Communist Party. And this was a commission for the Mexican government for a French exhibition, and it obviously got censored. So it was never sent there, but it was a great coup for Rivera, and it got him back into the Communist Party. For me, this is about as close as he gets to socialist realism and one of his least interesting political paintings. This one is, I think, a little bit more interesting. It was painted in 1954, and with great irony, he calls it Glorious Victory, and it's about the US intervention under Eisenhower in Guatemala that undermined a democratically elected reformist government that, among other things, went after United Fruit and tried to implement a massive land reform, and they were put out in a sort of proxy. Guatemalan was put in its place, initiated one of the most horrible historical 50 years, 300,000 lives lost during the Cold War. And in this way, in some sense, this sort of explains a lot about the appeal of the Communist Party in Latin America during the Cold War, when the United States was intervening in a variety of mostly covert ways. So I find this interesting, and very interesting as an artifact. And then finally, I'll end with this beautiful lyrical, the full version of the Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in the Alameda, which I opened with, right? This is, I think, his greatest work from the last 20 years of his life. It's really not Rivera the revolutionary, but it's Rivera the nationalist, the folkloric, the central cultural figure of the 20th century in Mexico. So I have a more formal ending, but I think I've gone way over time, so.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Well, I will turn my microphone on. Thank you, John. Obviously, you are spending a lot of good intellectual energy on taking alternative histories of our country and other countries and connecting them with art. Because when you go to Florence, or you go to Paris, you get your interpretation of the Madonna con Bambino. And I'm sure Jane has more information about that. But this is a very important piece of information, and I hope you're gonna be writing it into a book. Is that
That's the idea. I have a
That's-
contract and
okay?
I ignored my deadlines.
So, let me see, are there any questions from the audience or online? Nothing online? Okay. Tien, would you like the microphone so we can all hear your question?
So thank you so much for coming out to give this talk. Something that's really personally interesting. I also grew up in Michigan and, was first exposed to the works of Rivera at the DIA. Many times sitting there just pondering and looking at Detroit industry. So I have a question. I apologize because this may keep us all here for another hour. When I learned about Mexican muralism, I kind of learned that there was 3 really great artists, Rivera, Siqueiros, and Roscoe. And they all painted massive works in public art. They all left extant works in the United States. So I guess one question, I have 2 questions, which is one, why do you think Diego Rivera is kind of like by far the most well-known and remembered? And the other question, especially in the United States, and the other question is, like, from what I understand, all 3 of them had very communist, if not just left-wing leanings. Right, but also had very different politics and affiliations. And do you think that played into how they are remembered or their popularity nowadays? Thank you so much.
I got my own. Well, Diego Rivera was a demon in terms of his capacity and his desire to paint. And so I think in sheer surface area, it was impossible for anyone to keep up with him, right? That's one reason. Another is I think his visions are much more accessible and readable in both political terms and in figurative terms than the works of Orozco and Siqueiros. Orozco, I think many people would argue he's the greater artist. Some of his sort of works are monumental. They're, I'm not an art historian, so I can't sort of, he's less interesting to me in part because he sort of deals in existential issues, right? The sort of tragedies of humankind, the eternal betrayals. He was never a communist. He came close, and I found some in my Picture of the Proletariat book. I reproduced some of his early murals and his caricatures, which are very sort of bitter and dark, and but equally condemn capitalists and the church and workers as sort of. So there's very little hope in his vision in his most communist era, and some people call him an anarchist, right? He had ties to the anarchist groups during the 10-year struggle of the revolution. In the 30s, when a lot of his images are very aware of the similarities between the mass politics of the left and that of fascism. So he still has a special place for among the left in Mexico, but whereas Rivera continually has this sort of hopeful vision of the future, there's a certain distrust in Orozco of human nature, right? So he resorts, and as a historian, the historical references are far fewer. Prometheus is more important than Zapata in his repertoire. Siqueiros was younger. He was much more obedient to the Communist Party. And in some ways, that he followed the rules. you know, they slapped his hands, they expelled him about the same time as Rivera was expelled. They expelled him because his girlfriend was well, anyway, it's a long story, but he basically, he took the punishment, he waited it out, and he continued to serve the Communist Party. He went out and organized mine workers in a way that makes Rivera's connections to unions look pretty pale. And when Stalin said, go shoot Trotsky, he did. He missed. Right? He's in the middle of his painting his most interesting and ambitious mural ever. This is first, you know, until 1940, he's too busy doing politics. He's in the middle of painting this very interesting mural for the Electricians Union. And he goes and he shoots up Trotsky, he misses him, and then he goes into hiding. So his politics are, and he also sticks much more closely to the changing communist line. Right? So I don't want to belittle him as a servant of the Communist Party. On the contrary, he had the discipline that the Communist Party expected, and then, you know, in 1959, he supports protesting workers and speak up, puts him in jail for 4 years, right? So he's an extraordinary political figure that makes Rivera look a little soft, right? For Rivera, he saw himself as a leftist, as a communist, but painting was always his primary exception, right? It would have killed him to have to put down a paintbrush.
And John, I think we have one question there, and then the last question will be here because the cleaning crew is gonna come in pretty soon. So anyway, question there, quick, and then I'll give it to this gentleman here.
Very interested in the sort of analysis of Yuval Noah Harari, the historian, Israeli historian.
Oh, yes, I've never read him, but I've heard about him, right? That's sort of big mega history and.
Yeah, Sapiens was the book that, you know, really put him on the map. And he was talking about AI, and one of his great fears about AI is he said, you know, really, the Industrial Revolution was the last time that technology changed so dramatically in human society. And it took 200 years, essentially, to sort out how it might work. We had communism, we had fascism, we had major wars, world wars. And he's now looking at AI and saying it's of that scope of it will change things that radically, but we don't have any time. We won't be able to work out how we live with this and survive it. And this is his great fears that we're not allowing time. And that's just a statement about the time, because I think a lot of Rivera is looking at technology, real understanding that this is a huge force that's changing everything, and there's a great deal of confusion. What do you think he would do with AI if he had to?
Well, as a painter, he wouldn't have to do anything. You could just tell AI, do a Rivera-like mural about the future of mankind, humankind, and
That's a good answer.
I can certainly imagine, you know, what he might do with big computers, right? If he'd been around for another 10 years, right? I mean, I guess there were computers already when he died in 1957. But you know, I really don't know, but that's a really good point. Technology was central to particularly his vision of the United States and his interests, his concerns.
Come back in 25 years and we'll have an answer, because John is going to write the definitive book, and you should include that in your last chapter. What if an AI came and helped? Well, with that, thank you, John, once again, Dr. Lear, thank you.
I, on the other hand, am terrible with technologies. I appreciate the help with that.
Thanks so much.